This is Autoline After Hours with John McElroy and Gary Vasilash, episode 556 for May 6th, 2021. Looking at Lidar. Will this tech make AVs happen?
Watch Autoline After Hours live at Autoline.tv every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 p.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to this podcast for free by searching for Autoline in iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
John, how are you?
I'm doing okay, Gary. It's great to be back on the show.
Yeah, we missed you last week.
I know. And it almost should be role reversal here. I should be asking you what happened on this date in history.
That's true, but I'm going to ask you what happened on this date in history.
Oh no.
This will be on this date in history in 1928.
Uh-huh.
And it has to do with let's call it a local automaker.
Okay. On this date in 1928, I'm going to say this is the date, and it's a local automaker, that Ford shut down the Highland Park plant to prepare for opening up the Rouge a year later.
That may have happened, but so far as I know, it didn't.
Okay.
So
what's the real answer?
Chrysler established DeSoto.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So the DeSoto brand, which ran until 1961. And what was sort of interesting about that is, as I looked into it, is the fact that it got DeSoto so it would have a brand that would be slightly lower than Chrysler to be able to bring in more buyers. But later in 1928, it ended up buying Dodge Brothers, as it was still known. And that provided them with this lower price vehicle. So basically it had two fighting with one another. And so it didn't work out so well for them.
Yeah, well, it worked out for a number of decades there, I guess.
Yeah, but I'm sure they would have probably done a better job had they not bought Dodge. But then again, had they not bought Dodge, where would all the muscle car enthusiasts be?
That's right. We wouldn't have a Hellcat today.
Probably not driving DeSotos. Okay, enough of that. So let's bring in Alexa St. John, who's with Automotive News, a new person to the Autoline After Hours family.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Good to see
have you on, Alexa. So tell us a little bit, your background. What do you do at Automotive News?
So I cover tech and mobility and also suppliers for Automotive News. They're technically two different beats, but as you guys well know, very much so overlapping areas these days in the industry. So on the mobility side, it's a lot of electric and connected and shared, as well as micro mobility from time to time. And on the supplier side, I'm sure you can imagine, I'm keeping very busy with this chip shortage. But, typically all things supply chain, visibility, manufacturing, R&D, economic development, all of that. So honestly, it's a really exciting space to approach from both ends there, both the mobility side and, the more traditional side, I would say.
Oh, I love it. Micro mobility is one of my favorite topics. And, mobility in general, that's the growth engine of the industry.
Absolutely. And, it's so fascinating to watch all of the suppliers try to evolve into that space, whether it's, electric and, shifting to different types of propulsion. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's happening quickly for some of them. And for some of them, they're struggling a little bit more to keep up, I think.
Well, you're perfect for our guest today, Mircea Gradu, who is the Senior Vice President of Product and Quality for Velodyne. So welcome, Mircea.
Thank you. Good to see you, Gary and John, and good to meet you, Alexa. I really enjoyed your comments.
So Mircea, to begin, everybody talks about LiDAR. Give us an explanation of what it is in a simple way so our audience can understand.
So John can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So LiDAR, actually, the acronym LiDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. And It's actually in the name. So it's essentially a device that emits laser beams. And by doing so, it's able to detect objects and range objects, namely determine the distance to an object. There are many other functions that the LiDAR is used for in the perception stack of a autonomous vehicle or ADAS, in an ADAS environment. What the LiDAR can do as well is actually help with not only detecting, but also classifying objects, and then driving a variety of decisions at the vehicle level to avoid collision, to perform various ADAS functionality. So it's a kind of safety and comfort, convenience oriented device, and safety is certainly the main focus for us from the development perspective.
Mircea, maybe you can help me out here, because who invented it? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. Some years ago, somebody at Ford said, it was one of our engineers who suggested to the founder of Velodyne that he should go out and invent this thing. And then at a different conversation at a different time, somebody from General Motors said, it was one of our people who suggested to the founder of LiDAR that he should go out and do this thing. So who invented it, and where did he get the idea?
Yeah, so certainly we are very proud of everything what our founder did, David Hall, in terms of the innovation and invention related to LiDAR. David invented the surround LiDAR, which became literally the kind of landmark and symbol of autonomy. If you recall the initial so-called HDL64 LiDAR, which is a bucket-shaped device on top of vehicles. That was David's invention, and certainly that was the product that was commercialized for many autonomous vehicle developers starting in 2005, as early as 2005. And it did develop in smaller and more compact and more efficient devices and more performant, but that's truly the as I said, the symbol of this revolution that we have in the autonomy space. And he won and competed certainly with the device and with the vehicle, actually, in the DARPA challenges as early as 2005. Certainly there is a bias from other competitors, but David became the supplier of LiDAR devices to the other competitors. And that helped overall the industry. It helped, and it's the same mechanism that we see today. We learn from our customers, and our customers learn from us. And again, the primary goal of what we are doing today with LiDAR is safety. Just in a nutshell, something that differentiates LiDAR from everything else, just to leave you with that, because it has its own light source. It emits laser beams, right? So it doesn't depend on lighting conditions. And that's a key point that we would like to make. LiDAR would enhance and will enhance safety in low light conditions, in dark conditions. So I'll talk more about that, but it's just food for thought.
Alexa.
I recently wrote about the testing you're doing with the pedestrian automated emergency braking system. And that nighttime point was, one of the things I really wanted to address in that story. We know that pedestrian deaths, particularly at night, are a real problem. And, LiDAR, like yours, sounds like it could be the solution.
Yeah, absolutely, Alexa. And the idea of actually enhancing the protocols, the testing protocols, doesn't necessarily, it's not something extremely new as in last year or year before. It started a long time ago, and in 2000, as early as 2017, actually, NHTSA conducted testing that showed the limitations of existing systems, exactly in those low light conditions. And the motivation is more than 80% of the fatalities, and certainly the deaths that I'm mentioning are occurring in low light conditions. I think it's a natural evolution of the perception suite on the vehicle and the overall capability of an autonomous vehicle or ADAS to be able to perform very well in those conditions. The comparison that we did was done with a vehicle equipped with camera and radar versus a vehicle equipped with one of our LiDARs. And the results are very, very compelling because we followed exactly the NCAP protocol, and there are various degrees of overlap between the vehicle and the pedestrian dummy that is used in the simulation. In other words, you can see that the pedestrian coming from the side at a certain defined speed, the pedestrian dummy certainly, is overlapping with the longitudinal direction of the vehicle motion. And that's again the NCAP protocol. But what's important is to see that in 5 of 5 conditions, we managed to avoid the collision and maintain a safe distance about 1 meter to collision. That's where the vehicle stopped, the vehicle equipped with LiDAR, versus the camera and radar system kind of suffering from the inability to actually detect the pedestrian dummy and the child dummy at that location. So certainly, it's result very similar to the previous NHTSA results, and that drives our conclusion that LiDAR is a must in any ADAS or AV future perception suite or stack.
Mircea, you mentioned that David Hall invented the system that had the spinning bucket on top, the chicken bucket that is so famous. But certainly,
I didn't call it chicken bucket though.
I think the technical term is spinning doohickey.
Okay, well, that's a progress from the
yeah. So certainly that's gone away. I mean, so what is something spinning around in these smaller units? I mean, how does LiDAR work?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our website, we have 2 categories of products. One is an evolution of the initial HD 64 beam LiDAR that you're talking about. And those rotating and surround view LiDARs, as the name says, basically have a 360 degrees field of view capability. So they are extremely well suited for autonomous vehicles because you place them at a good vantage point on the vehicle, usually on a rack on the vehicle roof. And from that location, it can detect everything what happens within traffic around the vehicle and has very little blind spots, which is the key actually for for performing safely the AV functionality. The other category of products that are equally suited for autonomous vehicles, but also target embeddability in the current styling of vehicles are this so-called solid state products. And we have a Velodyne product line and the Velabit product line. We're very proud with Velabit. We won several awards. It's the industry's smallest LiDAR, therefore extremely embeddable, as I said, in the vehicle without disrupting styling, which we all know is extremely important currently for consumer vehicles. And I think with this solid state product, we can actually address very well, essentially the topic of this discussion, which is level 2 and level 3 ADAS functionality. And all that in conjunction with the software that, as Alexa mentioned, is focused on pedestrian automated emergency braking. We didn't pick that again. We didn't pick that function just coincidentally. We picked it purposely because it's making the most impact on safety. And that would be a good step forward. It's not all about convenience. We certainly can address comfort and convenience of the driver and giving them back time during the commute with functionality like traffic jam assist and others. But safety prevails, and those devices will be able to address again the majority of the traffic accidents that, by any statistics, are being confirmed as occurring in low light conditions.
Mircea, where do you stand in cost of these things now? Because I know when David Hall first invented the system, they were like $70,000 or $80,000 a piece. And I want to say about a decade later, Velodyne came out with a unit that was $7,000, which was a massive reduction in cost, but still way too expensive. So can you give us a ballpark number where the Velobit might cost?
Oh, absolutely. And certainly we are moving toward mass production and, again, feasibility also from the economic perspective or commercial perspective in mass-produced vehicles. But just to put things in perspective and bust that myth related to the $70,000, well, yes, the device may have been in that price or cost range. How much was the vehicle at the time? If you assess the cost of the vehicle, the proportionality is right there. And I'm not probably being out of the ballpark if I would say the vehicle was in the $1 million range as a prototype. So there is a proportion, and it's something that happens and occurs during the development process. These very early prototypes on the vehicle side are extremely expensive. And so there was, as I said, there was an effort to actually push the industry forward. And part of that effort now is the cost reduction, as you said, and translating this or transferring this into the mass-produced range of if you want, enablers of autonomy and ADAS features. So right now we are lower than, in the $500 range for the Velodyne product that I was talking about. The H800 is an example of what we launched recently, specifically for the PAD functionality and some other ADAS functions. And then we target a significantly lower price for the Velobit, and we envision also the use of multiple Velobits around the vehicle in order to cover, as I said, all the blind spots and potential operating. The operating driving domain or design domain of the vehicle in ADAS varies depending on what the manufacturer wants to offer. It can be a park assist functionality. It can be an adaptive cruise control functionality. It can be lane keep assist. All things require different orientation, different fields of view, different performance requirements for the devices and for the overall ADAS. And we're trying to optimize specifically for this function.
So just quick follow-up, and then I'll throw it off to Alexa. But so you might put one at each corner of the car, say 4 of them, and be still under $500.
Yes, that's the target in case of Velobit. And there are combinations of Veloray and Velobit. Again, everything supported by the Vela software that we are providing. And honestly, I think the industry is becoming extremely receptive to the use of LiDAR. There are multiple examples. There have been announcements related to the launch of LiDAR in level 2, level 3 platforms, vehicle platforms. We are extremely happy with the exclusivity on the LiDAR side that we recently received for supplying the FF91, which is a Faraday Future vehicle, and it's an electrified platform. It's actually the future of all the mobility trends. It's electrification converging with autonomy, and that's probably the best of both worlds, because autonomy capitalizes on of an electrified platform and benefits from that. We need electric actuators to respond really quickly to what we tell them to do. So that's the best scenario where you get, again, an advanced feature that we are providing from the ADAS perspective on an electrified platform. So yeah, that's a very good example there, and there are several others. Speaking also to the example that you mentioned, John, where you have multiple LiDARs around the vehicle.
One of the things that comes to mind for me, at least aside from cost, is just the sheer number of LiDAR players that seem to be out there in the industry. I mean, I think at one point, maybe this was pre-pandemic at CES or something, but, hearing 70, 80, different LiDAR companies in this space right now. I'm curious, given everything going on in terms of, the impact of the pandemic maybe on the mobility industry, obviously the chip shortages impact on the industry, but what's really the outlook for LiDAR companies or the state of the industry for LiDAR companies? I mean, are you anticipating, consolidation and the far and few between to really shine through? And at what point might that happen?
Sure, and that's a great question. And again, coming back to our history, I'm not going to start with 1928 as but we have more than a decade of experience, and that differentiates us from the other LiDAR players. And I'm not saying that casually. It's not just time passing by. It's time with a lot of content in terms of what technology we tried during this period of time. And to your point, Alexa, there are indeed many players in the industry, each of them trying to find a niche in terms of technology that offers something better or a certain advantage. There are always trade-offs. And at Velodyne, and David in particular had a chance over this time frame that I was mentioning, which is very significant. He had the time to actually try all this. And we continue to try and develop in parallel various technologies and select the best one. That's why I was saying that we are trying to optimize as much as possible for the application requirements. We're not playing only in the automotive space. We play in many, many other industries, including drones and certainly the last mile delivery on robots. And in general, AMRs, the automated mobile robots that certainly are used now in the context of COVID. COVID-19 sparked a lot of interest in those for various reasons. So we are in multiple industries and are trying to distill what's the best technology for each of them, certainly with the goal in mind to reduce cost as well. So the read across between industries is also important. But, the consolidation is something that, will be a resultant of let the best technology win, let the most performant, and most capable device win. We see a lot of interest from the tier one. The tier one manufacturers are equally interested in enhancing their capability in this space. They bring a lot of discipline from the perspective of developing product that ultimately goes into consumer hands, and a lot of emphasis on safety. So there is a mutual learning process, and whoever will be able to keep up with that and deliver at the required level for certain industries like automotive, commercial vehicles, and aerospace, that company will win. And that's not a simple set of requirements. There are buzzwords in the industry now like SOTIF, Statement of Intended Functionality. Prior to that, a few years ago, there was a lot of emphasis, and there is still a lot of emphasis on the so-called functional safety. Those are, to automotive, they are certainly a little bit of a new perspective on how things are assessed. And that perspective has been brought by this particular emergence of automation in the automotive space. Statement of intended functionality means that the device performs as intended. There is no failure at the device level. But overall, the system doesn't do what you're expecting it to do. And that's a problem. It doesn't matter if the device performed well. The overall system didn't react to a specific operating condition or a specific traffic condition. It didn't do what you were wanting to do, and that's in itself a problem. So, and we are trying to anticipate these scenarios, define them, and be able to mitigate them efficiently. So that's where the software and hardware kind of network that we are creating comes together with that ultimate goal to satisfy the statement of intended functionality.
Okay, Mircea, let me ask you a question. We're coming toward the end of this, and I'm very interested to learn this. So you came to Velodyne, you'd been at Hyundai in a similar position. If somebody like you now had gone to talk to you then, what would you have said to that person? I mean, would you say, well, you know what, we're busy getting cars, we're putting cars out, and you know, you're talking to me about this new technology, it's got lasers, and it's very confusing. I mean, so I mean, what is the reception that you truly get in the auto industry, and how much do these people need to learn so that they can deploy this in the most effective way?
Gary, there is a tremendous interest from their side, from the OEM side, traditional OEM side, and tier ones. That's what I was mentioning before. So there is absolutely no reluctance to actually embrace this new technology. It's just a race, actually, toward implementing this safety feature and multiple comfort and convenience features as fast as possible. Because, again, we are beyond the point, the reality is we are beyond the point where the need for the safety features was questioned. I think everybody, including you know, the traditional OEMs and the new entrants, they do recognize the benefits of this. Certainly, there is a testing occurring now in terms of the willingness of the market and the consumer to pay for convenience related to this feature. But who wouldn't like to, you know, be more relaxed in a traffic jam environment? Who wouldn't like to actually have the vehicle steering and correcting when, you know, it departs from the desired trajectory and so on? So I think overall everything converges toward this happening. So that's not a, well, I mean, I truly do not see any reluctance. I see the exact opposite. They want to learn, they want to actually implement and embrace this technology, certainly with all the cost reduction benefits that you would expect. Every penny matters in a vehicle, so that's certainly a huge emphasis on making this in a profitable way for everybody in the supply chain. That's the technology and the benefits of it, again, are I mean, I see a lot of almost an inflection point in terms of how this is seen. And we certainly want to educate everybody about the benefits of those functions. I'm talking about ADAS functionality and so on. Also about the benefits of LiDAR specifically. And we do that and we see a lot of receptivity. It's just logical arguments, very simple, common sense that we bring to the table. I mean, yeah, why wouldn't we avoid an accident in a dark condition, which is certainly prevailing in many areas. You know, you don't have always urban lighting available, and I mean, that's so obvious that nobody questions that. If you at a good, you know, price level, then there is no reluctance. Absolutely.
All right, John,
Mircea,
last
I gotta
question.
ask you, yeah, the last question here. Elon Musk has been very vocal, of course, that you don't need LiDAR, or certainly Tesla is not going to use LiDAR. We've heard his side of things. I'd love to hear your side of things. I understand I'm asking an executive at a Velodyne or at a LiDAR company. Nonetheless, what are your thoughts? You know, Tesla's done an amazing job with autopilot and full self-driving. There's issues with it, but it's still a level 2 system. Going to level 4 and level 5, I'd love to get your thoughts on the role LiDAR can play, or can you do it without it?
Well, I mean, to your point, what matters, and especially from the consumer's perspective, what matters is the end result. I'm coming back to the statement of intended functionality. It doesn't matter truly how you do it if the end result is good. If the end result is not good, then certainly you start to question certain ingredients in your recipe. And we don't want to get to the point where we actually learn that the hard way when we have so many logical arguments and testing available to actually drive a decision prior to anything bad happening. So I think we developed enough arguments, and the industry has enough arguments to justify the presence of LiDAR in a vehicle. In general, it's not just LiDAR. And again, we don't take that approach where we essentially preach about LiDAR being the only sensor on the vehicle. There is a sensor fusion approach that has to be taken, which should include cameras and ultrasound sensors and radar and everything else, along with LiDAR, and capitalize on the best characteristics of each of those sensors. Each of them has complementary features that can help the overall system perform better. I think that's the key and most key point that we would like to make, and the most beneficial approach. Once you eliminate one of those, then you certainly limit your capability to perform flawlessly. And I'll come back to my classic example. What about low light conditions, right? I mean, if you don't have LiDAR. Coincidentally, the testing that we performed was using one of those vehicles that you mentioned, and the results are very telling and compelling. And we published them. It sounds like Alexa had the chance to review them. So here's your answer. It's not about promoting one or another sensing technology. It's about actually getting the system to perform as intended. And ultimately, the only thing that counts is to avoid collision.
Okay, Mircea, Gradu, we're going to leave it there. Want to thank you very much for your participation in today's show, and wish you the best of luck. So we're going to take a quick. Okay, great. So
Thank you
we're
so
going
much.
to hear.
Thank you, Alexa.
Thanks.
Okay. We're going to take a break and hear from our sponsor, Bridgestone. So I thought it was very interesting, his talking about the importance of different types of sensors to be brought together to fulfill the statement of intended functionality, I believe. So Alexa, are you hearing that a lot when you're talking to makers of systems like Velodyne systems?
Oh, definitely. And, John, I'm glad that you asked that question. It was kind of bold there at the end, but, that's absolutely right. You have to have a combination of, LiDAR, radar, and camera. They all have their own limitations, and they all have, their own benefits. And cameras, you're hearing they can get debris, or if it's raining, or, whatever the case might be, that's going to cover it up. You have LiDAR that can, have a lot of advantages in a nighttime situation. So I think it's, every single day that I hear it, it has to be a fusion of all three, regardless of, how high tech or how quality, one component of the three is, you still need all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So Alexa, he talked about this nighttime testing. Are you familiar with that? And he suggested that they were using a Tesla in that nighttime testing, and it sounds like it hit the pedestrian dummy.
Yeah, and those images from Velodyne that we saw are a little bit graphic, honestly, to see a car just kind of quite literally run the pedestrian right over. And with Velodyne's pedestrian automatic,
It was a dummy, though. Let's say.
Well, sure, we'll make sure to specify. But I mean, with their system, it's kind of remarkable that it's able to detect in a dark situation, which historically is really, really challenging for these sorts of systems to navigate. And, we mentioned already pedestrian fatalities are, pretty much at an all-time high. And there's really no excuse for that, given vehicles are more and more equipped with more technologies by the year. And yet that's still such a pervasive issue. So it's kind of just fascinating seeing the comparisons between one system and another that is equipped with LiDAR. And, it's clear LiDAR is making a difference here. And, to my question too, is there being so many different players in this space, Velodyne seems to really be, at the top of that. And he pointed to their contract with Faraday is just one example. They're, seem to be making moves in this space, and this is just one pretty dramatic example.
Look, I'm just happy I learned a new acronym, SOTIF.
I had not heard that one either, to be honest with you.
So I thought it was interesting. He was talking about, the existence of the spinning unit that would be on the tops of autonomous vehicles. And, I got to thinking about that. I mean, seriously, autonomous vehicles don't have to be very stylish, right? I mean, basically all they have to do is be very functional, because odds are none of us will own them for a long period of time. And therefore,
that's not what Mary Barra says, and maybe we can get into that too.
yeah, well, let's get into that. But I mean, just think about that. I mean, what a great way of getting the 360 view, right? And no blind spots. And even though it may not look as attractive as something you'd want in your driveway, it does the job because it's not your car.
Well, right. And I mean, it depends on the application too. If you're talking, an autonomous shuttle, for instance, it's really not your car. And not only is it not your car, you're not even renting it. You're just hailing it, essentially. Right. And so that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, but you're right. If it's a low-speed shuttle, who cares if you got this big spinning bucket on the top of the vehicle? But if you're going at highway speeds, that's massive amounts of drag. And so these little solid state units that you can embed into the car, not only will the stylists want that, from an efficiency standpoint, it's going to be a lot better.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's kind of fascinating to see how these are evolving over time.
All right, John. So you brought up Mary Barra, and so we ought to go down that road. So she put out a letter this week when they did their earnings, and I got her high points here. And it is interesting, the emphasis that she placed on electric vehicles, as well as, a glance at autonomous vehicles, saying, they introduced the Lyric 9 months early. They introduced a new, or a second Hummer EV. They're expanding the use of Super Cruise into vehicles like the Bolt EUV, the Chevy, which they said, we'll be bringing that out this summer, so that'll be their second electric vehicle. They introduced Bright Drop and hope to have the Bright Drop cargo vehicle delivered by the end of this year. They are expanding their battery making capabilities. They're investing in Solid Energy Systems, another battery company. They're going to be building a vehicle for Honda, building a vehicle for Acura electrified. I mean, so what do you see going on there, John? I mean, is she basically saying, you know what, we're going all in on this stuff, and that's where we're going to be?
Yeah, GM made a strategic decision probably a couple of years ago, looking out into the future and saying, hey, we're going to have to go electric. Look at all these governments and cities that are talking about banning the ICE. And now, several years later, they're not just talking about it, they're doing it. And so the thinking was, look, if we're all going to go to battery electric vehicles, let's not mess around. We don't need to do plug-in hybrids. We don't need to do strong hybrids. We just need to go battery electric. And as long as we're going to get there, let's go whole hog. Let's be vertically integrated. Let's have extremely good competence right down to the cell design. And now you're starting to see the results of that. And it's going to come like a tidal wave in the next couple of years out of General Motors.
What do you think, Alexa?
Yeah, I mean, certainly just that was a list of 10, 12 kind of pledges out of the company, very ambitious. But, also it's a really exciting area to be in right now. And if that's what it takes for broader adoption, I think, why not make a lot of those, I won't say promises, but I'll say, a lot of those declarations, maybe, I do think there are a lot of barriers to get to that point. Obviously, infrastructure, of course, everyone's still talking about the charging infrastructure, as well as concerns that consumers have about charging, whether those are realistic or not. Most consumers will be able to charge in their own backyard via their garage. And if they happen to take their electric vehicle out on a road trip, at that point, the infrastructure, I'm sure, will be available. And if not, it's, called rent a car. Or I was speaking to someone, they said, rent a car, fly or don't go. So, those sorts of concerns still need to be addressed, though. And, that's going to take a lot of work, I think, from government, which, we're seeing the Biden administration pretty engaged on the topic of electric vehicles. So that can only help matters. We're seeing companies like EVgo, who GM has, partnerships with, ramping up their infrastructure. So that's just kind of one thing. I think the range anxiety conversation is definitely waning. So I think that's less of a concern on the consumer end than, say, charging would be. But I don't think you can go wrong with good, big kind of statements like that. But I think there are still some things in the way.
John, one of the things I wonder about is that General Motors is putting $2.2 billion in Factory Zero to build the Hummer, Silverado, and the Cruise Origin. They're putting $2.3 billion in Ultium Lordstown to build batteries. They're putting $2.3 billion in Ultium Spring Hill to build batteries, and they're putting $2 billion into the Spring Hill complex to build the Lyric. I mean, this is a lot of billions of dollars that somehow have to be paid for by people buying all of these electric vehicles that they're going to be having. If people don't start buying all of these electric vehicles, what's going to happen?
Yeah, ouch. Yeah, if that doesn't happen, GM and literally every other automaker. I mean, I think if you look at the declared amount of investment going into EVs, Volkswagen's even got more money on the line than GM does. So that's a real risk. But, as Alexa just pointed out, the Biden administration is talking about bringing out a lot more incentives. They've got the incentives in Europe. And that's going to be a potential game changer for the industry. Not only could it entice more customers to come into the EV market sooner than they might have otherwise, it allows automakers to sell these vehicles at an MSRP where they can make a profit, and like government subsidies, get it down to the point where people will pay for it. And I think that was something that was missing out of my calculus a couple of years ago. There's even talk in the US right now of getting rid of the tax credit for EVs and making it a direct rebate at the point of sale, because a lot of people just don't have $7,500 of federal taxes to write off. And so that kind of credit doesn't do them much good. And that's how they're doing it in Europe. It's point of sale rebate to the consumer. And I had not anticipated that governments would be stepping up with these kinds of monies, these kinds of subsidies just a few years ago.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Aside again from that infrastructure point, the cost is really sticking. Another point that I wanted to bring up too is just grid preparedness, which is kind of a whole other tangent that we could go off on, a whole other show in and of itself. But that too, I think, is going to require some of that interest from the government as well that you're talking about.
Totally agree. Though I got to tell you, in talking to the electric utilities, I mean, they're licking their chops over electric cars. Yes, they are going to have to upgrade the grid, and there's a bunch of other stuff, cyber hardening and all that stuff that's got to come along too. But I mean, these are the razor blades for the razor companies, so to speak. Electric cars for electric utilities. This is a potential windfall for them.
But doesn't it seem odd you don't hear a whole lot from the utilities in terms of their proactively recommending people buy electric vehicles? I mean, we see commercials on TV here that, we'll come take your old refrigerator away and give you $50 for it. They don't say, hey, buy an electric vehicle and we'll give you a rebate on your electric costs.
Right. Get a charger put in your garage and
right.
We'll cut your bill this month.
Yeah.
It may just be that we're so early in the game. Look, EVs in the US, at least 2% of the market. And, we'll sell maybe 250,000 EVs this year out of a market that, if you go by the April SAR, it was 18 million. I don't think we're going to get to that number. Nonetheless, they're still a small sliver of what's out there. I don't know if that means that the utilities will come with the kind of advertising you're talking about at some point, Gary, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do.
I wrote a story. It may have been in Automotive News. If it was, then I give you guys credit. And if it wasn't, I'm sorry for whoever wrote the story. And it was about the charging companies, the companies that are involved, like you mentioned EVgo, Alexa, and there was a quote from the CEO of ChargePoint. Now, ChargePoint sells electric charging stations, right? So somebody buys a station from them, and they'll maybe do some logistics, but basically it's like, okay, this is your station. This is no longer a charge point thing. And this is a quote from the CEO, quote, "I wouldn't want a driver as a customer because I think I'd starve to death. There's not a lot of money in electricity." And if you look at the numbers in terms of even gasoline stations, okay, they're making their money off of Slurpees and beef jerky, not a whole lot of money off of selling gasoline. And, in the story, I mean, it's making these points that, okay, there are lots of places where you can pull up and park your car and charge, like at a shopping mall, let's say, right? And you go and shop or go see a movie or do whatever. Your car's charged, that company's getting no more revenue because that's sitting there. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you just play that out. And so I just wonder whether there aren't, I mean, if the infrastructure hurdle is not merely having enough plugs, but people being able to make enough money from these plugs. I mean, we look at Electrify America. I mean, that, huge system, but why are they putting that in? Because they have to, because of the Dieselgate issue.
Sure, and I think it's just going to require a lot of strategic planning on their parts, and a lot of partnerships to get to that point that it is sustainable long term to operate a charging network or to own some sort of charging infrastructure. I've talked to EVgo every once in a while, and they really don't like, is it chicken or the egg? It's chicken and the egg, or more commonly they say it's peanut butter and jelly. Like, all of these things have to come together. You can't just have the charging infrastructure and say, okay, consumers are going to go out tomorrow and buy a car now that they see it. And it's also not going to be the flip side. Oh my goodness, all these consumers have EVs now and nowhere to charge them. It's really just all going to go hand in hand. And, I think it might be one of those things. It happens more suddenly, and it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to take a quick break and hear from Borg Warner, and we're going to come back, and I want to talk about supply chain.
The world is changing at an ever-increasing pace. No matter what the mode of transportation, there is always the need for an efficient propulsion system. And that's exactly what Borg Warner has been doing since the earliest days of the automotive industry. We create innovative mobility technologies that reduce energy consumption and emissions while improving performance. Our proven track record has made us an industry leader in forward-looking propulsion solutions for combustion, hybrid, and electric vehicles.
Okay, we're back. So every day it seems that there's another OEM saying that we're going to put a plant down because of the chip shortage, and then another one the next day, and then the next day, and the next day. Alexa, what's going on here? You talk to a lot of people who are in this space. What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the best way to put it, right? Every single day there's something else that's down for, be it 2-3 days at a time or a week at a time. Automakers are really getting hit hard right now by this chip shortage. And, I spent a lot of time talking to their suppliers. Interestingly enough, we haven't seen yet much impact on the supply side in terms of earnings throughout the first quarter. But, most of them are expecting the real heavy hit come Q2 this year. And, we're hearing that this chip shortage could even, be drawn out well into the second half. I heard a couple of projections a few weeks ago that this could hit early 2022. So not sure about that one, but it's definitely not going away anytime soon. And all of this ultimately is just accumulation of pent up demand, kind of as the pandemic started waning, come end of 2020, unexpected pent up demand, I guess I should say. And here we are. Automakers canceled a lot of orders last spring, last March, April, May, while things were down and looking like they were going to be down for a while. At the same time, big tech kind of swooped in and, grabbed the supply of chips as everyone's working from home, doing schooling from home, et cetera. And, when it came time for the automakers to, bring those orders back up, the chips simply weren't there. And you got a lot of companies, be it the foundries, be it the automakers, be it their suppliers, working on this, trying to get at this, and it's not getting better. It is not getting better.
All right, so I know John's going to jump in, but I want to ask you something before he gets in here. I can just see him as just okay. So the automakers, when the pandemic began, when the lockdown began, they basically said, "Okay, we're canceling our orders. We're not going to buy any chips." And it seems to me that their planning people, their MR people, they should all be fired, because basically they anticipated this being a very, very long pandemic. Okay. Now you said that the tech companies swooped in. Isn't it basically the tech companies just said, "Hey, we're selling a lot of Xboxes. Oh, you got some chips? We'll buy them." It's just like, it's the auto industry caused this problem. It isn't the semiconductor people. It's the auto industry for canceling the orders.
Well, right. And, chips in particular, I mean, no component really, but chips in particular cannot be created overnight. I mean, you can't build one of these facilities overnight. You can't ramp up production for chips overnight. This is a really complex component, probably the most complex component. And at the same time, one of the most significant components right now. I mean, cars are only becoming more and more electronic. We just talked to someone about, autonomous driving features, all of these things that are requiring more and more chips on board. And, I actually kind of posed that question to a source, shouldn't the OEMs have kind of anticipated this or predicted this? And, some people say who was to predict anything that came after the pandemic? I mean, it's such a, volatile situation across the board for so many industries. Can't blame the tech companies necessarily for capitalizing on that opportunity. And, they had their own kind of needs to meet, like I said, with people working from home and, doing their educations from home, but also the Xboxes, and cell phones and all of those sorts of devices. So I've had probably, 10, 20 people tell me this was the perfect storm.
All right, John, now you're going to jump in. You're talking about reshoring. I just want to make one point, one single point, okay, that the TSMC that is building the plant in Arizona, they are investing $12 billion in that plant. Now tell me about reshoring.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with everything that's being said. I'd point out this week, Carlos Munoz from Hyundai came out and said, "Hey, we never canceled our orders." And I found that a very intriguing comment, because certain countries, South Korea included, got a handle on the pandemic very, very early. Remember, they did the whole tracing of people. They did a lot of testing of people in Southeast Asia. As you guys know, it's much more common to see people wearing masks even before the pandemic hit. So it was not uncomfortable for that population to adopt that practice. Long story short is Korea did not have big lockdowns, not government mandated ones. And so I think that was, I don't think that Hyundai was maybe smarter. Maybe they were, maybe they understood the supply chain better. But the point of the matter is they did not cut their orders. We know that Toyota's fared better than others. I wonder if that was the same thing going on at Toyota, that maybe they didn't cancel their orders, or maybe not as many. But I'd cut the industry a little bit of slack in that it was government mandated shutdowns. Remember, there were some of them who were like early on, we're not going to shut down. We're just going to keep on going, until government said, no, you're shutting down. And that's why they canceled their orders. They as I had pointed out all along this thing, if they had said to the chip companies, "Hey, look, we're pulling out a line right now, but we're going to be back in 8 weeks because that's when we're going to reopen," they would have avoided much of this. Now, remember, too, there was that fire with Renesas in Japan that really caught them. That alone would have caused problems. There was the grid going down in Texas because of this cold weather snap that shut down, I think, three plants, 3 chip manufacturers. That would have hurt the industry. So it's this convergence of everything going on that's really caught them out of sorts. And the only solution is going to be build more fab plants. And Alexa, as you pointed out, That's going to take a couple of years. And Gary, as you're pointing out, it's going to take tens of billions of dollars.
Okay, why do we need more plants? That's the question. We don't need more plants. They have the capacity. The problem is that, okay, if a plant burns down, okay, you got to rebuild it. Okay, the plants in Texas are back up because, near as I can tell, it's no longer frozen down there. Okay, those plants are there, right? Yeah, is there greater demand for more cell phones? Yes. Is there greater demand for, more vehicles? Yes. But I mean, I think proportionately, just building more factories is not the solution. It should be better planning.
Look at the conversation we just had with Mircea. They're talking about adding LiDAR onto cars. That's going to take more chips right there. The whole movement to connectivity, we're right around the corner from every car being connected. That's going to take more chips. When we get to autonomy, that's going to take more chips. Car sales globally continue to grow. Right, consumer electronic sales continue to grow. I would argue we do need more plants. Now, do we need as many as are going to get built? That I don't know.
And do we need to really hurry up and do this? Or can we just basically say, okay, the market works, let's just follow the market? Alexa, you get to answer.
I think the thing is you can't just hurry up and do this. So only time will tell. I mean, we were talking earlier, President Biden's been working on the EV side of things. He's also had a say in this chip crisis right now. And John, you made a really good point in that I think this is just the culmination of so many different things hitting the supply chain right now. It's not just the chip shortage. It was, remnants from the pandemic impact on the industry. It was the Texas storm. It's all sorts of these things. And, it's interesting to me as suppliers reporter that on one hand, it seems like the supply chain hasn't learned a lot of lessons through all of these crises, not only recently, but over time. We did a look back at the tsunami out of Japan in 2011, and, some of the same exact lessons learned that people talked about from back then are being applied now. But all of these disruptions, at the same time, are just they're different. They're different. Each crisis. No one could have predicted the pandemic. No one would have expected Texas to freeze over for a week. And impacting both foam and also the chip companies. I mean, it's just all at once. So I also don't blame the industry in kind of really, really wanting to ramp up. I think you're right, Gary, in that the chip demand isn't going to, be overwhelming, but it certainly will increase over time from the auto side, just based on vehicles becoming more electronic. And, I guess it doesn't hurt to kind of be a little bit more prepared next time.
I got to correct myself. I had called him Carlos Munoz. It's Jose Munoz, and I know better than that. But I'd add one more thing that goes to it, at least as in terms of building chips and chip plants in the United States. We're so overly dependent on importing chips. I think the U.S. is able to do 12% of the demand, meet its own demand. And clearly from a geostrategic standpoint, that's not good. And you're going to see a big push on to reshore as much of that production as companies think they can get away with.
So why did it go away in the first place? Because it was more cost effective to do it somewhere else.
Well, of course, but that was because of countries like Taiwan, like South Korea, like Japan, like China that said, hey, let's put the policies in place to make sure that we have a dominant position in this. And the United States, being as capitalistic as we are, is like, oh, if you guys want to subsidize it, go ahead, we'll give you the whole business. And now, again, from a geostrategic standpoint, we realize we went too far in that regard.
See, I look at it from a slightly different point of view. John, you remember when the auto companies got religion, which was called just in time, remember? And the real heinous thing, the ultimate sin was just in case, because just in case meant that you had inventories, right? Okay, so what have they done? They've leaned out everything. And as Alexa said, you go back to, what was it, 2011 with the tsunami,
right?
When they had the same problem, right? That they didn't have availability because those plants in Taiwan or Thailand were down, and isn't it a case whereby they ought to say, okay, you know what, we really maybe need to have some warehouses. Maybe we really need to stock some of these things that are so critical to us, because basically we're going to get to the point where we're going to say, okay, we talked about all these electric vehicles. Where do the materials come from to build those batteries? Well, not a whole lot of them from around here. So do we suddenly say, oh, we got to build an infrastructure for that and something else and something else and something else? I mean, where does it stop?
Right. I mean, I'm hearing a lot, or I'd say a decent amount about kind of changes in the supply chain and logistics processes, kind of stemming back from that just-in-time theory that seemed to work, so well for so long. But when it comes to something like, a fire out of a supplier, I think last fall, that shut down, things for just a couple of days, and that can only clearly, as we're seeing in this situation, get more dramatic depending on the component and the extent of the situation. So, I mean, I kind of expect definitely some revisiting of the supply chain. I know that tier ones are trying to get more visibility into their tier twos and tier threes to navigate these sorts of issues as they come up. It'll be kind of, I don't know, interesting to see what changes might come of this. Again, I think it's like one of those things, suppliers talk about learning these lessons each time there's a crisis and say they might be changing up some things and want to get more visibility and transparency, down the tiers. Whether this will be the crisis that actually, implements a lot of those changes is the question.
And remember, just in case, where you had mounds of inventory, led to all kinds of quality problems, prevented you from introducing improvements to a redesign or implementing it quickly, was very expensive to carry. So that's why the industry has gone to just in time. And besides, if you go back to the old days, you might have a warehouse full of a month's worth of stampings. Okay, well, once you burn through that inventory, then what? I mean, so you've had this enormous cost and you ran out anyway. I think, having said that you're right, Gary, that there's going to be needs for buffers of critical components and critical materials, and maybe not run quite as lean. It's easier to do when it comes to materials because it doesn't have quite as impact on quality as when you have components. But there's no question, high levels of inventory is not good for business.
All right, John. So I want to ask you, you weren't on last week's show, and we talked all about micro manufacturing. What's your take on that? And would it be beneficial under current circumstances?
Well, number one, I love that show. I watched it, even though I wasn't able to be part of it. I think Arrival is really onto something of being able to develop vehicles with far less capital investment than the traditional approach. And as a startup, I give them a gold star. They're one on my list that I think is going to be able to survive. Gary, as you and I have talked about on shows, I think most of the startups are going to fail. There will be several that do make it through. But coming back to your question, look, supply chains are supply chains. And whether you're doing it on a micro basis or a mass production basis, you got to have access to it. Now, it's easier to control if you're only making 10,000 vehicles a year instead of 250,000 out of a given plant. So maybe you can manage your way through a crisis more easily just because your volumes are lower. But, supply chains are supply chains. And if they run dry, it's going to bring everybody to a grinding halt.
All right, Alexa, I'm going to ask you the last question. What is it that you see in your reporting that people probably aren't paying as much attention to as you think they should?
So that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think we're going to start to see, and we're already kind of seeing it, the impact of the shortage, when it comes to dealer lots. And I'm not sure that the general consumer that's not an enthusiast or not as plugged into the nitty gritty of the auto industry is paying a lot of attention to. Is if you're going to try to go get a car right now, at some point you may have a little bit of difficulty doing that. I think that's kind of been a slow burn in terms of, are we ever going to see this chip shortage, trickle down to the dealerships? But I think, we're kind of hearing that in some areas and for some brands, it is doing that. So I think that's one big thing to pay attention to. What else? I don't know. I feel like I cover a lot of ground. I wear a lot of different hats from time to time. But I mean, John, to your point just now, in terms of not every startup's going to survive this. I think that's really critical too. I think some people do think about that, but there still seems to be a lot of vaporware or pipe dreams out in the field right now, and it's as a reporter challenging to sift through, who might come out on top and whose name we won't know, in a matter of weeks. I was covering Guidehouse Insights automated driving systems ranking just a week or so ago. And, they had been working on that for a couple of months and had to change the ranking just because a few of the players kind of fell out, or, there was an acquisition or something like that. And that happened pretty quickly. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind too, is this is a very evolving, very dynamic environment right now, both on the supply side as well as the mobility side. And both are going to come probably with some pretty big changes moving forward.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to wrap up the show. So Alexa St. John, Automotive News, thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Great job, Alexa. Good to have you on.
Thanks so much.
So John will be back next week, and it'll be a show we're going to dedicate all to new vehicles, what we see in 2021, whether we've driven them or not, what we're looking at, what we're expecting. And I think it'll be an interesting show, but not as interesting as this show just was. So thank you all for tuning in.
For that one.
That's great.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
Visit our website, Autoline.tv, where you can watch us live Thursday afternoons. Get your daily fix with Autoline Daily and in-depth analysis and interviews with Autoline This Week. There's all that and much more at Autoline.tv.